An alternative agenda is therefore needed that reorientates the banking system back towards its essential and more modest purpose, managing the payment system, providing appropriate levels of liquidity, and directing credit to productive and socially useful activities. Ultimately, I'll argue, this will require the reassertion of democratic authority over the financial system, both shadow and real banking system, particularly those privileged institutions that create and allocate credit within the economy in order to re-anchor finance in the real economy. Moreover, I'll argue, it will require innovative new forms of collective ownership to ensure the process of financial accumulation works for broader public benefit. I'll explain how those measures can be achieved shortly. However, first I do want to ask, how has financialisation foreclosed democratic renewal? Financialisation, as Greta Krippner argues, refers to the pattern of accumulation in which profit-making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. This transformation not only increases the economic and political power of the financial sector versus the rest of society, it also drives the dramatic accumulation of debt from those slides that is consequently spread to the rest of the economy. This process forecloses economic discovery by, in Will Davis's acute phrase, freezing the rhythm of politics. For politics in the Arendtian sense exists between past, present, and future. It draws on memory and tradition in its everyday acts, proclamations, and policies, while its vitality is in offering the hope that the future is as yet undecided, with collective action still capable of imagining and enacting new institutional trajectories of society. Politics, in short, claims to make the future indeterminate, contested, and hopeful. With the power to issue and direct new forms of credit, financial institutions also act between past, present, and future. But unlike political life, they seek to make the future priced, certain, measurable, and tradable, determining the future in advance by investment and through bringing forward future resources as debt through the elastic production of money. This gives finance capitalism its immense power and productive potential. However, in the process, it also binds down societies and households as past financial obligations and accumulated debt contracts, both past and in the future, constrain efforts to reform. Unfinancialisation then, and indeed a neoliberal political economy more generally, politics has been supplanted by an anti-political form of economics, in which those who have the authority to decide and measure the future in advance are increasingly institutions insulated deliberately from popular democratic pressures. And the technocratic form of rule now being imposed on the sudden deficit states of the Eurozone is arguably the apotheosis of this process thus far, although probably not the end of it. But arguably no democracy has been immune from the post-democratic drive to replace popular democratic sovereignty with a depoliticised form of market sovereignty. Financialisation has therefore been central to the long, ongoing transformation of post-war capitalism and its relationship to democracy, a relationship that's always been uneasy and contested one. By facilitating first rising levels of public debt and then financing a dramatic increase in private debt in a regime of privatised Keynesianism, financialisation has allowed capitalist democracies to buy time, in Wolfgang Street's phrase, evading fatal distributional conflicts between social actors, voters on the one hand, and private capital interests on the other. Yet this process of debt-based evasion has had a fatal democratic consequence, as it's seen political and economic power gravitate away from democratic institutions, the electorate, and the labour force, and towards financial institutions and economic actors immunised from democratic pressure. Moreover, it has increasingly cramped the capacity for democratic state action, so we've gradually moved from a tax state, in which public spending has been financed generally by taxation, to a debt state, where public debt has increased to cover a retrenched tax base, to increasingly what we see as today's consolidation state, where, as we saw in yesterday's budget, discretionary spending is squeezed, and there is a priority, at least politically in electoral politics, on servicing debt. Financialisation, then, has eroded the capacity of democratic actors to renew and invent new futures for themselves, with the locus of political sovereignty increasingly shifting to financial and market-based institutions. Fundamental reform is therefore required if we want to reconcile the dynamic of our economy as it's going with the integrity of our democracy. If the central challenge for excessive financialisation, then, is to democracy itself, the route for renewal, to politics of alternatives, is to insist on reasserting democratic sovereignty over the financial system, a great transformation that will require a Polanyi-like re-embedding of the political in the economic. In particular, reform must address the deeper institutional arrangements that underpin financialisation through a democratic reformation of finance, ensuring greater public oversight, accountability, and, if necessary, ownership and control. This will require new principles. First, and as been hinted at today, we should acknowledge the financial system as a vital utility and the flow of credit to the real economy an essential public good. Therefore, credit-giving institutions need to be better guided and made accountable to democratic institutions. It also requires us, again as reiterated today, to take far more seriously the fact that the creation and circulation of money and credit within our economy is not a neutral process. Indeed, as Jeffrey Ingham argues, the money system has a dual nature. It is not only infrastructural power, it is also despotic power, and this duality is central to economic and power inequalities in financialised societies. Democratic institutions should therefore seek, as a priority, to rein in this power. The second principle is that definancialisation will require institutional experimentation, both public and private. We cannot simply rely on just regulation of the financial system to get ourselves out of this mess. Institutions also need to be reimagined or created in new ways to support and equitably sustain value. These include, and this is often not discussed, those crucial intermediaries and practices that facilitate the financialising of our economy and currently ill-serve the public interest. For example, the operation of credit ratings agencies, the inadequacy of equity ratios, or the opacity of the monetary system. Reform must address each of these in turn, as the constricted dynamic of financialisation is to be reversed. And without such an agenda, finance will continue to be a dominant master, not effective servant of the British economy. So, what concretely could this mean? First, and it's slightly alluded to by Steve, a process of credit guidance should be established to re-anchor stable credit growth in the real economy. Banks have a unique economic privilege in our economy, and that they create and allocate between 95 to 97% of the money supply, and the Bank of England paper referred to sets out very neatly why that is the case. Yet they badly discharge their role as custodians of the money supply, which historically has been a role for sovereign prerogative. Most new credit in the UK and in other financialised economies does not go into generating sustainable returns through new business investment or productive capital formation, as is classically assumed. For example, in the UK today, nearly 90% of outstanding domestic loans go to fund either financial transactions, property deals, or consumer debt. Only 1.5% reach the manufacturing sector, and politicians like to go on about the manufacturing sector, but that clearly is quite a low ratio. Admittedly, some of this credit going to financial transactions and the real estate market has some productive purpose, but too much circulates to achieve accumulation for accumulation's sake. And the UK's woeful productivity and investment performance are just one obvious symptom. More broadly, a system in which financial institutions are free to create and allocate most of the credit created in the economy as they choose has clearly been creating too much the wrong sort of debt, only loosely attached to productive capital formation. And in the process, it helps fuel asset bubbles and financial instability, it unbalances the economy regionally, and helps constrain rather than drive the productive potential of the UK. Credit guidance could help address this by giving the Bank of England, in coordination with the government, a clear new mandate to set overarching, rolling guidelines for quantity and type of credit created in the economy. In particular, it should track two key measures of aggregate credit growth in the economy and act if the amount or type of credit being created exceeds these guidelines. First, it should ensure the rate of growth of bank credit for non-GDP based transactions does not exceed the growth rate of overall bank credit in the economy over a sustained period of time. GDP enhancing credit is something that the ONS and the Bank of England measure, and it's GDP sort of based investment that goes into investment for the production of new goods and services. Non-GDP enhancing credit is for asset transactions or consumption. And obviously, GDP is a problematic metric, so you could use a different one within credit guidance, but the ONS, because it measures it, this would be something we could readily apply sort of in the next few months. Now, making sure that bank credit for non-GDP based transactions doesn't exceed the overall growth rate of bank credit is critical for ensuring broader macroeconomic stability, because there's very strong evidence, and again on those slides earlier, that credit growth for these types of transactions above the rate of overall credit growth in the economy is a canary down the mine in terms of impending financial crises. Now, in this new guidance system, investors and consumers would of course be free to engage in non-GDP based transactions, However, the creation and allocation of new money for these types of transactions would be restricted, given its negative externalities. Second, a rolling target should be established to increase the amount of credit created that flows to GDP enhancing transactions over non-GDP transactions, which again, there is really very substantial evidence to suggest is critical to delivering sustainable productivity improvements over the long run. Left to its own devices, we see that the credit market currently channels far too much investment towards property and financial speculation. For example, if we look at the total amount of bank credit created in the UK, the proportion of bank credit allocated to unproductive asset transactions over time has multiplied significantly to a multiple of GDP, while that GDP-based transactions is basically stagnated. To correct this, a guidance policy should be set to rebalance this ratio over time, helping re-embed finance in the real economy. Guidance might appear a radical step, yet the state is already implicitly involved in ensuring the credit system. The Bank of England is a public-private partnership, with the Treasury accepting unlimited liability to underwrite the financial system. The question is therefore not whether it should be involved at all in shaping the money and credit system, it already is as a guarantor, but how democratic influence can be better brought to bear in shaping the system so it more effectively creates and sustains value in society. There are a broad range of policies that could support a guidance policy by ensuring more credit flows to productive investment purposes as a proportion of total credit circulating and being created, and making sure there are strong disincentives for creating credit from non-GDP based transactions. For example, and there are many of these, but the tax bias in favour of debt over equity financing could be removed to reduce the incentive to rely on debt financing new production. Similarly, the Bank of England could target stable asset price inflation as well as CPI, so reducing the incentive to speculate with new credit in real estate. Likewise, and as the bank has actually recently begun to do, mortgage credit could be better regulated and, if necessary, restricted, leaning against the overaccumulation of debt in that sector. Although to be politically sustainable, this would obviously, by corollary, require a very significant increase in house building and an assertion of use value over exchange value in how we create and allocate housing in the UK, which, seeing as it's not really on the agenda at the moment, that's perhaps problematic. We should seek to multiply and diversify forms of public banking in the UK with a focus on sustainable investment in the non-financial economy, thus helping meet any broader credit guidance target. Most obviously, this could be done by expanding the British Investment Bank, but experiments in public venture capital vehicles, regional banks, or sovereign wealth funds, among other things, could all play a role. For financialisation has not led to a more pluralistic, broader system of financing production. Indeed, as one appropriately titled recent work had it, the financial system we have today appears to be profiting without producing. Democratically accountable, the system of credit guidance could help correct this by rooting finance in production. The alternative is leaving the UK domestic banking sector as it is today, a highly interconnected, profitable yet fragile machine whose main role appears to be leveraging up existing property assets. The second thing we should try and do, apart from credit guidance, is as financialisation has advanced, the gap between the interests of finance on the one hand and those of society on the other have widened substantially. Tightening that relationship by reasserting the public interest over the financial system through creating democratically mandated and accountable institutions is therefore now necessary. Now, there are some in the report, but just a few. We could, for example, create a European-wide public ratings agency funded out of the EU's financial transaction tax and operating with a clear, autonomous governance structure that could provide an alternative signal of value in the financial markets compared to the present ratings oligopoly, which was so bound up in how the financial crisis emerged. Similarly, we could establish a public monetary commission with perhaps Steve on the panel, which could be a first step towards unveiling the mechanics of credit creation and its influence on economic, social and political power relations. It could also examine in the process radical reforms such as providing central banking services directly to anyone who wants them, not just the banks, or the potential for money financing the deficit, to see how the monetary system can be tinkered with to better serve the public interest than at present. Equity requirements is another obvious one, and they should be strengthened significantly to undermine the current operating model of banks, which relies on very high leverage, extreme indebtedness, and fragile sources of debt that threaten broader macroeconomic stability, as we've learned. In doing so, it would reduce the still very significant implicit public subsidy banks too big to fail continue to receive, which the IMF estimated, based on these low equity requirements, was worth £65 billion in the UK in 2013-2014. And interestingly, the Federal Reserve is already moving in this direction of raising HQ ratios, and it's really high time the UK followed. At the same time, as we build these institutions and set up a product guidance type system, it will be difficult to debankalise the economy, so it's important to build institutions that can disperse claims on wealth. So the UK should also establish a citizens' future fund type model, which would own assets and financial equity on behalf of the people, investing the proceeds to meet the long-term needs of the country. Hypotheticating certain financial operations, for example a scrip tax on bonuses or during mergers and acquisitions where the fund would take twice the equity, or for example using another round of QE to buy equity rather than gilts. This could provide a sustainable base for funding public investment over time, based on the public ownership of financial institutions and capital. And so the example is kind of like the Meidner plan in the 1980s, a sort of rough model for this. And once a proportion of any profits made in this fund were reinvested to ensure the fund's sustainability, the remainder of the surplus from the fund could be used to fund public investment as set out in the fiscal strategy of the government of the day. And it could perhaps, for example, be used for a basic income, which is obviously raised up the agenda. In doing so, a citizens' fund could help address the fiscal dilemma in funding all modern democratic states committed to maintaining reasonable levels of public expenditure in the face of financialised economies. For rather than trying to tax these financial capital, innovative new forms of public ownership of financial capital, the state acting as a rentier in essence, would allow for the social accumulation of the proceeds of financialisation to help directly fund vital public expenditure in the future. Now, definancialisation undoubtedly presents a challenge to the language and approach of political parties towards the financial sector. The slogans of this Parliament, what they are, one nation, and we're all in it together, both empty out the conflict inherent in financialisation between different classes, different regions, and different sectors. What is required instead is a confident assertion that finance is vital to the UK's future, but it must be more productively anchored in the real economy, and in a way that deepens and broadens democratic life, allowing for this politics alternative to emerge. Clearly, this is currently not the case. Democracy, with the reforms I mentioned, should therefore reassert itself, even if, as FDR once said during the Great Depression when he was sort of reforming American capitalism, such actions earn the hatred of a narrow band of financiers. Now, this might sound like an ambitious agenda. Ranged against the wealth and power of organised finance, hope that such ambitions might seem remote. However, a useful and perhaps slightly unusual comparison might be drawn between today's financial system and the Catholic Church on the eve of the Reformation. Two imposing cultural, intellectual and social systems that claimed a totalising logic, powerful, whose elites spoke and operated in the vernacular beyond deliberately the understanding of ordinary people. Yet arguably now, as then, the hierarchy imposed by excessive financialisation is shallower and deep-rooted change remains possible. Now, the ideas I've set out today is not part of the 95 Theses, and I'm telling about Martin Luther, but it is hoped that, and this is maybe not the church in Woolworths or wherever we pin that thing on, but what it is hoped is these principles and policies can help set out an agenda for a much still urgently needed financial reformation. No, fine. I would